I guess it's one of those things you never think will happen to you. When I first noticed the small changes, I brushed them off. Looking back, it's almost embarrassing how blind I was, just going through the motions, thinking things were fine, or at least normal. Sarah and I had been together for years, and like any couple, our life had settled into this routine. I'd work late, come home to a tired but familiar smile, and then we'd fall asleep, side by side but worlds apart. Now, don't get me wrong, Sarah is a good person, at least I used to think so. But as it turns out, you can be a good person and still do terrible things. I know she felt distant, unfulfilled. I guess the spark faded a bit, but I thought that was just marriage. We had a life, a house, responsibilities. I didn't think she'd go looking for something, or someone else. It all started at this cafe near her office. She started talking about it, how she'd go there to relax, get a coffee, and escape. She'd tell me about the jazz music playing in the background, the dim lighting, the smell of coffee and warm pastries. It was her little haven, she said, a place where she felt like herself again. I listened, but I didn't think much of it. I just thought she was trying to find some space. We all need that, right? Then she met him. Zach. Just saying his name now makes my stomach turn. He was some young barista, early 20s, all tattoos, cocky smile, the kind of guy who probably thought he was God's gift to women. And apparently he was just what Sarah was looking for. At first, it was innocent, or at least, that's what she kept telling herself, I'm sure. I bet she told herself he was just being nice, giving her that extra attention. A heart in the foam on her coffee, a little note slipped in her hand. Have a great day, beautiful, or today is your day. She started lighting up every time she went to that cafe, coming home with this look I hadn't seen in years. That look used to be for me once. I never suspected anything at first. Maybe I didn't want to. But now, knowing what I know, it's so obvious how it all started slipping away, bit by bit. She started dressing up a little more, new clothes, a little more makeup than usual. Perfume she hadn't worn in years. It was subtle at first, so small you could blink and miss it. But those small things started adding up, and eventually, it was impossible to ignore. I'd catch her on her phone, lost in her own little world, and when I'd ask her what she was doing, she'd just say she was catching up with a friend. I believed her until I didn't. It wasn't long before this so-called innocent connection went beyond the cafe. One evening, she came home a little tipsy, flushed cheeks and bright eyes, smelling like a place we'd never been to together. She mentioned meeting some friends after work, something casual, she said, but she couldn't look me in the eyes when she said it. That's when I started feeling it in my gut, that nagging sense that something was off. I didn't push it, didn't confront her then. I just let it simmer. Weeks passed, and she kept going to that damn cafe, looking forward to her mornings like it was the highlight of her day. They started having deep conversations, or so she said, about dreams and passions. And I was the one at home, making sure everything was taken care of, thinking it was all just a phase she'd moved through. She was finding herself, she said, and what could I say to that? It's like she was talking to a different person whenever she told me about these little chats they'd have. He wasn't just some barista to her anymore. He was this guy with passion, with dreams, filling her head with who knows what about living in the moment and finding happiness. And suddenly, she started seeing her life with me as some kind of cage. She'd brush his hand accidentally when he'd give her a coffee, and I'm sure she convinced herself that it was just friendly, just two people connecting. But those looks she was giving him? She never looked at me like that anymore. And there I was wondering if this was just how things went in marriage, convincing myself that everything was normal. Then came the real kicker. He asked her out. Well, he probably didn't call it a date. It was just some concert, something fun to share with someone interesting, he told her. And she bought it. Or maybe she just wanted to believe it was harmless. She told me she was going to a concert with friends from work, something casual. I believed her. God, I was a fool. The idea that she'd go out with this guy never even crossed my mind. She was my wife, after all. Apparently, they had a hell of a night. She'd mention it later, all casual like, oh, we had a great time, and then we went to this cute restaurant afterward. Nothing fancy. But what she didn't tell me was that it wasn't just friends. She told herself it was innocent fun, probably, or maybe that she was just letting loose, getting a break from the monotony. But the way she came home that night, that glow, that laugh that wasn't for me, That's when I knew things were worse than I thought. The next part I only found out about later, but it's burned in my memory now like it happened right in front of me. After their not-a-date, they walked back to his place. She told me later how it happened, how he looked at her like she was some kind of goddess, how he leaned in slowly like he was giving her the option to pull away. She didn't. She didn't want to. And when he kissed her, that was it. She crossed a line she couldn't uncross. They ended up at his place, where she felt alive again, free, young. She was living some teenage fantasy, some idea of what life could have been if she'd made different choices. But she'd made her choices, hadn't she? And one of those choices was me. That's what cuts the deepest. If I had to pinpoint when things really started to feel different, I'd say it was right after that night she went to the concert. It was like a switch had been flipped. She wasn't the same person coming home. Not really. And maybe it sounds dramatic, but I could feel it in the way she looked at me, like I'd become just another piece of the furniture. The way she laughed when her phone buzzed, or how her face lit up with some private joke that I wasn't a part of. I noticed these things. At first, I told myself I was imagining it, but it became too obvious to ignore. One of the first things I noticed was how much she was suddenly into her appearance. Don't get me wrong, Sarah's always been beautiful, but she was never the type to spend hours in front of the mirror. Now, she was putting more effort into her clothes, makeup, even perfume. Perfume she hadn't touched in years. I remember the smell. It was the same one she'd worn when we first started dating. I used to love that scent. Now, whenever I caught a whiff, it just reminded me of how things were slipping through my fingers. I didn't say anything at first. I didn't want to come off as some paranoid husband, reading too much into things. But she kept pushing further away. It was like there was this wall between us that I didn't even know how to start breaking down. When she was home, her attention was somewhere else. She'd spend hours on her phone, her face glowing in that screen light, and whenever I asked her what she was doing, she'd give me vague answers, just talking to a friend or scrolling through some stuff. It didn't sit right with me, but I still told myself to let it go. Maybe she was just stressed. Maybe she was going through something she didn't know how to talk about. I tried to give her the space she was asking for, even though every instinct in me was screaming that something wasn't right. Then came the nights out. She'd leave in the evenings, dressed to the nines, telling me she needed time to recharge. I'd sit there, watching her get ready, wondering who she was dressing up for, because it damn sure wasn't me. When I'd asked her where she was going, she'd get all defensive, saying she just needed a little time alone. Alone? She'd never needed that before. But every time I'd try to push for more information, she'd get irritated, rolling her eyes like I was smothering her. It was around this time I started noticing how often she'd sit there, smiling at her phone. She'd be typing away, completely oblivious to me. I'd try to start a conversation, but she'd just brush me off or look up with this distracted expression, like I was interrupting something important. And every now and then, I'd catch this look on her face, almost guilty, but she'd quickly hide it behind some excuse, pretending nothing was going on. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think that this was just some weird phase she was going through. But it kept gnawing at me, that uneasy feeling. I remember thinking that if I just ignored it, maybe it'd go away, that if I pretended hard enough, things would go back to how they were. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing her. I didn't want to think she was seeing someone else. It felt too big, too horrible to even consider. So, I did what any guy in my position would do. I reached out to my best friend, Mike. We've known each other since high school, and he's been through enough with me to know when something's off. I didn't even want to tell him the whole story at first. It felt too embarrassing. But when I finally laid it all out, he didn't laugh or dismiss it. He just listened, nodding, asking a few questions here and there. And then he said something that stuck with me. If it feels wrong, Tom, it probably is. Don't ignore your gut, man. Just be cautious. Hearing him say that out loud hit me like a ton of bricks. For so long, I've been telling myself I was just paranoid, that I was reading into things that weren't there. But Mike planted that seed in my head, this idea that maybe I wasn't crazy after all. He didn't tell me to go through her phone or follow her. He just told me to keep my eyes open, to pay attention. And then, there were the credit card charges. I know it sounds cliche, like something out of a bad movie, but that's what tipped me over the edge. One night, while she was in the shower, I sat there looking over our statements. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was that growing sense of dread, or maybe I just wanted to feel like I had some kind of control. But there they were, charges at fancy restaurants and bars that I hadn't set foot in. Places I'd never even heard her mention. Expensive places. And I knew right then and there that she wasn't going to these places alone. I still remember sitting there, my stomach churning, trying to come up with any explanation that made sense. Maybe she was going with friends? Maybe it was a work thing? But I couldn't shake the feeling that these were date places, the kind you go to with someone special. And it wasn't me. I hadn't taken her out in ages, not anywhere like that. When she came out of the shower that night, I couldn't even look her in the eye. She was standing there talking about something trivial, but all I could think about were those charges and what they meant. I felt like a stranger in my own house, sitting across from a woman I'd thought I knew, wondering who she really was. That night, lying next to her, I could barely slept. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what to do next. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but a part of me wasn't ready to hear them. I kept going back and forth in my mind, trying to come up with some excuse, some reason that didn't involve her sneaking around behind my back. But the evidence was piling up, piece by painful piece. I'd catch her staring off into space, that little smile creeping onto her face. And I knew, whatever she was thinking about, it wasn't me. And every time her phone buzzed, she'd jump a little, quickly glancing at it before tucking it away like she was hiding some precious secret. The hardest part was the silence. She'd go out more and more, leaving me alone in that empty house, trying to keep my mind off the things I didn't want to think about. And when she was home, we'd barely talk. It was like she was just existing next to me, not with me. I could feel myself slipping, sinking into this pit of doubt and suspicion, and I hated it. I hated what it was turning me into, but I couldn't stop myself from going down that path. The funny thing is, we'd never had a huge blow-up, no screaming matches or anything like that. Maybe that's what made it worse. It was the slow, silent shift, this cold distance creeping in like a fog, filling every corner of our lives until I barely recognized her, or myself anymore. And deep down, I knew that whatever was happening, it was only the beginning. If there was one person who might have known what was really going on with Sarah, it was her best friend, Jenna. They'd been inseparable since college, and Jenna was the type who could read people like a book. So when Sarah started changing, it didn't take long for Jenna to pick up on it. One night, she came over to drop off something for Sarah, but it was just the two of us, and we got to talking. She mentioned how Sarah had been distant, how she'd been canceling their plans, or saying she was busy. Jenna asked me if I'd noticed any changes, but I just played it off. I didn't know what else to do. Admit that my marriage was starting to feel like an illusion? That I could feel her slipping away, but didn't know how to stop it? I just mumbled something about work stress and tried to brush it off, but Jenna didn't look convinced. Apparently, she had tried to talk to Sarah, too. Jenna had asked her, point blank, about the cafe and her new friend. And from what I gathered, Sarah just laughed it off, saying that Zach was just a guy who made her coffee, nothing more. Jenna pushed her a bit, saying that she needed to be careful, that maybe she was getting too attached. I wish I could have been a fly on the wall for that conversation, watching Sarah try to dodge those questions. Jenna said that Sarah brushed it off as no big deal, and that she was just enjoying herself after feeling so stifled at home. It's innocent, she told Jenna, just a little fun. But Jenna wasn't convinced, and now neither was I. The problem was Jenna couldn't do much more than hint at things. She wasn't going to push Sarah too hard, and even though she was concerned, she couldn't really step in. And Sarah? Well, she wasn't about to take advice from anyone, especially if it meant letting go of whatever thrill she was getting from this guy. Around the same time, another character entered the picture. Robert. They'd known each other ages ago, and suddenly, he was back. Maybe they ran into each other by chance, or maybe she looked him up. I don't really know. All I know is that he became this friendly lunch buddy she'd meet up with during the week. She didn't hide it, really. She'd casually mention grabbing lunch with Robert, always emphasizing that he was just an old friend. The way she talked about him, it seemed innocent enough. But the thing was, every time she came back from one of those lunches, she looked a little lighter, a little more alive. I didn't think there was anything romantic going on between them, but I could tell that she enjoyed the attention. Maybe she liked the idea of having someone there to listen, someone who wasn't me. I was the one at home, trying to make sense of all these little things that didn't add up. And then she'd go off to lunch with Robert, confiding in him about who knows what, letting him fill some emotional void that I'd apparently stopped filling. Of course, she didn't tell him about Zach. That part she kept to herself, buried deep like some precious secret. Robert was the guy she could talk to about her frustrations, the one who'd nod along and probably tell her that she deserved better, that she was too good to feel trapped. But Zach, that was different. Zach was the one who made her feel alive, who gave her that thrill that she'd convinced herself she needed. Meanwhile, I was starting to feel like a stranger in my own marriage. Every time I tried to talk to her, I felt like I was hitting a brick wall. She'd give me these short, clipped answers, her eyes drifting off like she was somewhere else. And when I'd press a bit, ask her what was going on, she'd get defensive, telling me that she needed space. Space from what? From me? From the life we'd built together? At that point, I was so twisted up inside that I didn't know which way was up. Every instinct was telling me that something was wrong, but a part of me kept trying to shove it down, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. I mean, who wants to admit that their marriage is on the rocks? That the woman you thought you'd grow old with is slipping away? Inch by inch? I needed someone to talk to, someone who'd understand. So I called up Mike. He'd been my best friend for as long as I could remember, the kind of guy who'd always give it to you straight. When I told him about Sarah's behavior, he listened without interrupting, just letting me get it all out. When I finally finished, he let out a long sigh and said, "Tom, man, you can't ignore this. You know something's up. Don't let her make a fool out of you." It was like he could see the writing on the wall before I could. He didn't say it outright, but he made it clear that I needed to wake up and face the reality of what was happening. "Look," he said, "I know you don't want to think about it, but if she's hiding things, you need to pay attention. Just keep your eyes open." That conversation stayed with me. For the first time, I let myself admit that maybe I wasn't just being paranoid. Maybe there really was something going on. And once that idea took root, there was no going back. Every little thing started to feel like evidence. Every text she got, every smile she flashed at her phone, every late night catching up with friends. I started piecing it all together, like some sick puzzle where the only outcome was betrayal. I'd catch her smiling at her phone, that little spark in her eyes that I hadn't seen in so long, and every time it cut a little deeper. She wasn't thinking about me when she smiled like that. She was thinking about him, or maybe even both of them. Things got to a point where I felt like I was losing my mind, where every small detail became another crack in the foundation. I couldn't even enjoy a quiet night at home without feeling this creeping anxiety, this sense that everything was about to come crashing down. And through it all, she kept going to that cafe, kept meeting up with Robert, kept slipping further and further away. The funny thing is I didn't have concrete proof, at least not yet. But my gut was screaming at me, telling me that if I didn't confront this, if I didn't do something, I'd lose her completely. But I was terrified of what I'd find if I dug too deep, afraid that once I opened that door, there'd be no closing it. So I kept waiting, hoping that maybe this was all just in my head, that maybe she'd come back to me, that the woman I fell in love with was still there somewhere, buried beneath whatever was pulling her away. But deep down, I knew that things would never be the same. And Mike, he just kept telling me to be smart, to not ignore my instincts. Trust your gut, Tom. Don't let her play you. The truth was I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think that she'd betray me like this. But I also couldn't shake the feeling that I was already too late, that whatever we had was slipping through my fingers, and I was just standing there, watching it all fall apart. I don't know what finally pushed me over the edge that day. Maybe it was the months of ignoring the signs, the endless string of late nights, the secretive smiles, the quiet way she'd drift away from me with every passing week. Or maybe it was Mike planting that final seed in my head the night before. He'd looked me in the eyes and said, "You deserve to know, Tom. You can't keep living like this, man." And deep down, I knew he was right. So that morning, I made up my mind. I'd go to the cafe where she spent so much time. I'd sit in the background, unnoticed, and see for myself if there was any truth to the nagging doubts eating away at me. I called Mike. I needed someone there, someone to stop me if I lost it, someone to pull me back if things got too real. He didn't hesitate. He just said, "I'll be there. Let's do this." On the way to the cafe, my mind was a mess. I couldn't focus, couldn't even form a clear thought. I was hoping I'd be wrong, that all of this was just paranoia, that I'd find her there, sitting alone, reading a book, or maybe chatting with a friend. But in my gut, I knew better. I'd ignored my instincts for too long, told myself I was crazy, but standing outside that cafe, I couldn't lie to myself anymore. I had to know. When we stepped inside, the place was packed with a morning crowd. The soft hum of jazz floated through the air, mingling with the scent of coffee and fresh pastries. It was almost calming, almost enough to make me think that this was all a big mistake. But then, I saw them, Sarah and Zach, tucked away at a table near the window, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. She had her back to me, but I knew that laugh, knew that tilt of her head, that way she leaned in, hanging on his every word. My chest tightened, my pulse racing. I watched her reach out, placing her hand on his knee, her fingers lingering just a little too long. And Zach, that cocky smile plastered across his face, looked at her like she was the only woman in the world. They shared this look, this intimate, charged glance that made my stomach drop. I wanted to be sick. I wanted to yell, to scream, to tear that place apart. But I was rooted to the spot, watching my marriage shatter right in front of me. Mike must have noticed the look on my face because he gently put a hand on my shoulder, steering me back toward the door. "Come on, man," he whispered. "Let's get out of here. There are better ways to handle this." I couldn't even respond. I just let him guide me outside, my mind reeling, my heart pounding in my chest. The image of them together was burned into my mind, that stupid smile on her face, her hand on his knee like I didn't exist, like I'd never existed. It felt like my whole life had been ripped out from under me, like everything I'd believed, everything I'd trusted, had been a lie. As we walked down the street, I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me, this burning rage that I'd kept buried for so long. For months, I'd ignored the signs, convinced myself that it was just a rough patch, that we could fix it if I just tried harder. And all the while, she was sitting there, laughing with this kid like she didn't have a care in the world. I clenched my fists, feeling the anger surge through me, my vision blurring as I tried to make sense of it all. Mike was saying something about not letting her get to me, about handling things calmly, but his words barely registered. All I could think about was the look on her face, that smile, that soft, affectionate glance she'd given him. Something she hadn't looked at me with in years. "You don't have to do anything rash, Tom," Mike said, his tone calm but firm. "I know you're hurting, but this isn't the way to end things. There are better ways." I knew he was right. I knew that storming back in there, causing a scene, wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't take back the betrayal, wouldn't erase the months of lies. But that didn't make it any easier. Every fiber of my being wanted to march back in there, to confront her, to make her see the pain she'd caused. But deep down, I knew that wouldn't fix anything. If anything, it would just give her more reasons to hate me, more reasons to justify what she'd done. So I took a deep breath, letting the anger simmer just below the surface, turning it into something else, resolve. I wasn't going to be the fool anymore. I wasn't going to let her make a mockery of our marriage, our life together. If she wanted out, fine, but I'd make damn sure she'd regret every second she'd spent with that smug little punk. Mike must have sensed the shift in me, because he gave me a nod, his expression one of quiet understanding. "You know where to find me if you need anything," he said, patting my shoulder. "But don't do anything stupid, okay? She's not worth it." I watched him walk away, his words echoing in my mind. She's not worth it. Maybe he was right. Maybe the woman I'd married, the woman I'd loved, was already gone, replaced by someone I didn't even recognize. Someone who'd laugh with another man while I was standing right there, watching her world crumble. But there was a part of me, a stubborn, foolish part, that couldn't let go, that kept hoping she'd come to her senses, realize what she'd done, and come back to me. But as I stood there, replaying that scene over and over in my mind, I knew that things had gone too far. There was no going back, no fixing this. The damage was done. And maybe, just maybe, it was time I started thinking about myself, about what I wanted, about what I needed to do to move on. And as I walked away from that cafe, that sense of betrayal burning in my chest, One thought kept playing in my mind, over and over. Revenge. After the cafe, I was done feeling sorry for myself. I'd spent months wondering, worrying, and pretending everything was fine. I'd let Sarah twist me up, watching as she laughed and flirted with someone else right under my nose. So that night, I made a decision. I was done being the guy who sat on the sidelines, waiting for things to magically fix themselves. I wanted payback. Maybe it was petty, maybe it wouldn't fix anything, but I needed something to remind me that I was still alive, that I hadn't been completely gutted by what she'd done. Mike, being the solid friend he is, didn't even ask questions when I called him. "Let's go out," I said, and without hesitation, he was in. We hit one of the popular clubs downtown, the kind of place we used to go when we were younger before life got complicated. I hadn't set foot in a place like that in years. And as we walked in, the pulsing music and flashing lights, the crowded dance floor, it all felt surreal. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt free. Mike and I grabbed a couple of drinks, letting the buzz start to work its way through us. I could feel the tension melting, like each sip was washing away a bit of the anger and bitterness I'd been carrying. I let myself get lost in the crowd, in the bass, in the energy of the place. It was exactly what I needed, a break from the reality that had become my life. Then, out of nowhere, I saw her. Lauren, my ex from way back, the one who got away, or so I used to think. She looked just as stunning as ever. Maybe even more so, with the confidence that comes with a few more years. She spotted me first, a sly smile spreading across her face as she made her way over, looking me up and down like she was sizing me up. And suddenly, it felt like the years between us hadn't even happened. "Tom," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "Didn't expect to see you here." There was something in her eyes, a spark of recognition mixed with curiosity. And maybe, just maybe, a hint of something more. We fell into easy conversation, the kind that comes when you've known someone well enough to skip the small talk. She was confident, flirtatious, making little comments that made it clear she hadn't forgotten about us, about what we'd had. And it was hard to deny that I was enjoying it. Here was someone who actually saw me, who wanted my attention, who wasn't looking through me like I was invisible. Mike, being the good wingman he is, took a step back, letting Lauren and me catch up. And as we danced, as she leaned in close, laughing at my stupid jokes, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, wanted, needed even. I didn't stop her when she brushed her hand against my arm or when her fingers lingered a little too long on my shoulder. I let her play her game, and I played right back, thinking maybe, just maybe, this was exactly what I needed. And then, as if the universe was in on the plan, two other women joined us, Lisa and Melanie. They were younger, with that carefree look that only comes when you're out to have a good time, no strings attached. They gravitated toward us, Lisa taking a liking to Mike, and Melanie zeroing in on me. There was something about the way they looked at us, especially at me, a mix of intrigue and maybe a little danger. It was like they could see the raw energy radiating off me, the intensity of a man who'd been wronged and was ready to forget everything, even if just for one night. Lauren didn't back down either. If anything, she seemed to enjoy the attention I was getting, her hands slipping around my waist as if to claim her territory. She whispered in my ear, something teasing, something that made my head spin, and suddenly I didn't care about anything except the here and now. We were all laughing, the drinks flowing, the music blaring around us, and I felt like I was miles away from the mess that was my marriage. At some point, I don't even remember how, we ended up back in my place. Maybe it was the drinks, or maybe it was just the energy of the night, but none of us seemed ready to call it quits. The girls were laughing, Mike was pouring more drinks, and the air was thick with something I hadn't felt in years, a spark, a sense of release. Lisa and Melanie took turns flirting with me, giggling as they left lipstick marks on my cheeks, playfully tugging at my shirt, leaning in closer than was strictly necessary. Lauren watched with an amused smirk, clearly enjoying the attention I was getting, like she was in on the game. She'd whisper little things in my ear, things that made me laugh, things that made me forget everything else. And for the first time in ages, I let myself go. I let the night take over. Let myself be the center of attention. Let myself be wanted. I knew it was reckless, maybe even stupid, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to drown out the pain, to forget about Sarah, about Zach, about all the lies and betrayal. And in that moment, with Lauren's hand in mine, Lisa and Melanie laughing beside me, I finally felt free. The hours blurred together, a haze of laughter, flirtation, and the kind of wild energy that only comes when you've got nothing left to lose. We drank, we danced around my living room, we laughed like we didn't have a care in the world. It was messy, it was chaotic, and it was exactly what I needed. At some point, Lisa leaned in, leaving a bold red lipstick mark on my neck, a silent reminder of the night I'd had. I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, disheveled, wild-eyed, and for once, I didn't see the guy who'd been beaten down by life. I saw someone new, someone who didn't care anymore, who was ready to move on, to reclaim a piece of himself. When the night finally wound down, we were all sprawled across my living room, the remnants of the party scattered around us. Empty bottles, lipstick-stained glasses, the faint scent of perfume lingering in the air. I glanced around at the people around me, at the smiles, at the contentment, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of satisfaction, of closure, like I'd finally taken back a piece of myself. The morning after that wild night, I was sprawled out on the couch, still half asleep, when I heard the front door click open. I knew right away who it was, but I didn't move. I just waited, letting the moment build, listening to her footsteps get closer. Sarah stepped into the living room, and the shock on her face was priceless. Pillows were tossed everywhere, empty bottles littered the floor, and the faint scent of perfume still lingered in the air. Lauren, still half asleep, was curled up beside me, and across the room, Lisa and Melanie were dozing, wrapped up in blankets. It was a scene of pure chaos, one I hadn't exactly planned for her to see, but I couldn't have written it better if I tried. Her expression shifted, going from shock to something else, anger, hurt. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to find the words. But what could she say? For months, she'd been slipping away, piece by piece, finding comfort in someone else's arms. And now, here she was seeing me do the same. Finally, she managed to choke out, "Well, what is this?" I sat up slowly, feeling a calm settle over me that I hadn't felt in a long time. I looked her right in the eye and, with a small, satisfied smile, said, "Now you know what it feels like to be betrayed." My words hung in the air, cutting through whatever defense she might have had. I could see it in her face, the realization, the regret, maybe even a touch of guilt. She stumbled back, her eyes wide, as if she was only now seeing the mess she'd made, the damage she'd caused. For the first time, it wasn't me standing there with the broken pieces. It was her. Sarah didn't say anything else. She just stood there, taking it all in, her face pale, her hands trembling. And then, without another word, she turned and left, the door slamming shut behind her. The sound echoed through the empty house, marking the end of something that had been dead long before I'd realized. After she left, I felt this strange sense of relief wash over me. I knew that she wouldn't be back. Not really. That morning, I took back control. I was no longer the guy sitting on the sidelines, watching as his marriage crumbled. I'd finally done something for myself, something that reminded me that I was still here, that I still mattered. Word spread fast after that. I heard through the grapevine that Zach started keeping his distance from her, probably trying to avoid the fallout. Whatever they'd had, it quickly fizzled. The fantasy had shattered, and Zach wasn't interested in the mess that came with it. And Robert? Well, from what I could gather, he'd heard about her fling with Zach. The judgment must have been too much, and he'd quietly removed himself from her life. One by one, the people she'd leaned on for validation and attention disappeared, leaving her alone to pick up the pieces. As for me, I didn't waste any time. I filed for divorce that same week, and I made it clear that there was no chance of reconciliation. Mike and Lauren were both there for me every step of the way. Lauren especially. I don't know how, but she seemed to understand exactly what I needed. She didn't push, didn't try to force a relationship or make things complicated. She just showed up. She was there, steady and calm, a reminder that life didn't end because of one betrayal. After the divorce was finalized, Lauren and I talked about taking a trip together, somewhere far away where I could leave all of this behind and start fresh. It wasn't about romance, not really, not yet. It was about finding a new path, building a life that didn't revolve around the ruins of my marriage. I took one last look at the house before I left, locking the door on a chapter that had been full of pain, but also growth. The man who walked away that day wasn't the same one who had desperately tried to hold on, who'd ignored every sign, every instinct, hoping that love would somehow be enough to fix it. I was someone else now, someone stronger, someone who knew his worth. And Sarah? I don't know where she is or what she's doing. All I know is that she's alone, left with the consequences of her choices. And in the end, maybe that's the best revenge of all.